Jesus was slain from the very foundation of the world, from the beginning. And while the Scriptures are true that God did this in the fullness of times, mankind played its part. Although I will say, as we see this, the text unfurl in many messages to come, we will see that Jesus is perfectly in control. Then that's what we see in John chapter 10. He says that I'm going to lay my life down and then I'm going to take it back up again. And therefore Jesus was not in Jerusalem by happenstance or accident. God had predetermined that He would be at the place in our text today. It's according to the predetermined counsel of God. Jesus knew all of the details that would unfold before even the people doing them were aware of it. We see this in Mark chapter 10, verses 33 and 34. He had told the disciples, and He had told those who surrounded Him on 3 different occasions that He was going to go to Jerusalem. He was going to be apprehended, tried, crucified, that He would rise on the 3rd day. Understand, this knowledge was in complete detail. In short, Jesus knew the who, what, where, when, and why of His pending arrest. He understood the trial that He was facing, and He understood that He would be executed. He understood it well. You can find that in Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. Jesus is going to give His life as an atonement and as a ransom for all mankind. Atonement was required, and it would be He who would fulfill it. In today's text, we see this parable that Jesus gives us in Mark chapter 12. This is Passion Week. It's Wednesday. He is teaching in the temple. And the story that everyone is to hear, they would know it and know it well. They would understand it and be able to grasp it. It would be one that communicated a heavenly truth. There were thousands of people around Him, and the shock that had descended over them as we go through the text today is palpable. He cleansed the temple, and the high priest, well, he put them to shame. Not only that, but he further shamed them in his accurate and deep teaching that he offered afterwards. He didn't just cleanse the temple and then run. No, he stayed there and he taught. He had authority. And clearly, they did not. His authority, we've learned, that comes from a clear exercise of His power. Not only that, but in His teaching, He's drawing people in to Himself. Sad to say, His popularity was not going to last much longer. So what we find Him today in our text is that Jesus is in the temple again. He's teaching and He's preaching. The religious leaders who rule hate Him due to His popularity and His challenging of where they stood. These religious fanatics, they want Him dead. And they want Him dead desperately. There have been many assassination attempts on Him for many months. Today's teaching would raise the temperature even more. Let's look at the text and read it. Read along with me in Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. He says, "And He began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and he dug a pit for the winepress, and he built a tower, and he leased it to tenants, and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him, and they beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent yet another, and beat him and killed. And so with many others, some they beat, some they killed. he had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him, saying, they will respect my son. I mean, after all, he's my son. They will respect him. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him, and they killed him, and they threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The chief cornerstone, in fact. This is the Lord's doing, and is it marvelous in our eyes? And they were seeking to arrest him, but they feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him, and they went away. Kind of tragic, is it not? What we find here is, you can find also in Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 and following, and you also will find it in Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 16. Each of these records the parable. You see, the story that Jesus offers it's harsh. It's a harsh indictment. You see, the religious leaders are traitors, but they see themselves as good and charitable folk, dedicated to God. I mean, after all, they were disciples of Moses, so they say. They were following the law. I mean, after all, they're generous people. So Jesus is borrowing the first part of the story from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. You see, it would be familiar to these religious men. They would have heard it before. And what we know, if you were to look into that, into Isaiah, what we find is that in Isaiah chapter 5, in those first two verses, he says this. There's a vineyard, right? And in that vineyard, the vineyard owner has done what? He has hired it out. He's done all sorts of things when you read on into it. He's done what? He's dug up around it. He has put up walls. He's constructed a wine vat. He's made the choicest selection of vines to be grown in this. And so you see that, but what's the conclusion that Isaiah says? Not very flattering, huh? He planted it with the choicest of vines. He built a tower in the middle of it. He hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to produce good grapes, but it only produced worthless ones. They would have known that parable. They probably heard that before. And so, what we see in that example, as well as what Jesus tells, is what we see is farming by terracing. They would have terraced the rocky areas, and in the low-lying areas, that's where they would have had their standing fields of grain, in the flatter parts. So they would use these rocks in there, much like you see in the central part of Kentucky over near Lexington. They would make walls, and they would use all of those, and they would make protection. Walls, towers, that sort of thing. In the vineyard, they would make all these things. They would even hew out a place so that they could make a wine press. And basically all that is a depression where they would take the grapes, throw them in there, and then they would stomp on them. There'd be a bit of a lip so that they could channel it out and then bottle it up and use it. That was the normal practice of things, and it's even seen today. If you were to go to a winery, which is not far in that direction, Millanova, I believe it is, you would find something that's similar. Obviously, it has more of a modern touch, And so what Jesus has done is He's described this farm, if you will. It has everything. Everything necessary for the task at hand. And that's obviously because it's present, right? One could even say, as Jesus describes this vineyard, it was perfect. But what we find in the Isaiah passage, it says that it did not bear good fruit, but worthless. That Hebrew word is besum. The grapes were bad. They were sour. In fact, you would even, if you looked that up, you would even say that they were probably stinky. They smelled bad. Now, who's the owner? Well, in Isaiah, the owner was God. Here's the interesting thing. Israel is the plant He planted. So in Isaiah 5, what we see are a list of the documented crimes and sins against God. In fact, in that chapter, it is a railing condemnation. It is one of the worst in the Bible. If you drop down to chapter 5 and verse 20, it says they flip-flopped everything. The things that were good were bad. The things that were bad, they made good. Kind of looks similar to Israel in the day of Jesus. So what are the terms, if you will? Well, the owner, who is God, He leases out the property for a long time to others. Well, contract farming, as we know today, it still happens, right? We've seen it in our own country. Not only contract farming, but also sharecropper. Right? People will go out and they will farm the land and then give to the owner some proceeds of that. It's pre-agreed to. The leasees, in this case, the religious leaders, were to perform the work, and the fruit would have been, in a contract arrangement, would have been pre-agreed upon over the split, 60-40, whatever that might be. And with the owner getting some portion. And then what would happen in most of these things is that the owner would send an intermediary to collect the proceeds. Oftentimes, back then, it would be either the money that they would be able to secure or the grapes or the wine itself. So the leaders are to care for God's people. That's what Isaiah chapter 5 is talking about. They were to care for the nation as He would, but they did not. They are immoral hypocrites. You see, there is a time period that emphasizes this journey this owner took. And that time period, you can kind of look at it, was from the nation's formation all the way to the present day where Jesus is speaking to them. Indeed, the period if you would think about it, would go from the time of Abraham, from the Abrahamic covenant, I'm going to make a people out of your loins, etc. And if you think about it, the contract is what? Well, it's the law. Verse 3 gives us an idea of this intermediary, the intermediary that is sent to collect the proceeds, to collect on the account. So what do? They beat a man, they sent him away empty-handed. This is absolutely unbelievable, isn't it? It's actually criminal and it's immoral. And the hearers of Jesus' parable would have found it hard to bear. Verse 4 sees another slave go to collect upon the agreed amount, and they beat him in the head. They treated him shamefully. Actually, that word means to disgrace or to degrade them. Might have sent them away naked. That's the kind of connotation that we have. But now those who are listening to Jesus, they're getting into it. He's drawing them in. And they become enraged. They're quite enraged. And he He can do that. Jesus can do that, if you will. Verse 5, Jesus tells about another slave that was sent, who met his demise. They killed him. The fourth slave receives a stoning. The others were sent, and the same occurred. The owner kept sending intermediaries. And if you think about it, it went way beyond any type of customary practice. This was great mercy that the owner was giving. It was also a level of deference that was unbelievable. So what was going on in the minds of the hearers? Well, Jesus had connected them emotionally into this parable, if you will, and in their minds, it's time to send an army. This is going on far enough. So guess what? Jesus, he adds another layer and heightens it even more by saying, well, guess what? There's a son. He's sent. He's the next to arrive. And the heir arrives, and what do they say? The owner says, well, they're going to respect my son. Surely this is going to work. But those tenants had other ideas. They said, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and we'll have the inheritance. And what they don't know is that the owner is still very much alive, very much in control, but we're going to kill the heir when we'll have it. This was counter to what the crowd thought. A son is sent. And so they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard, and the last disrespect was greater than all the others. Then there's the payoff pitch, the question, if you will. What is it? What happens? What will the owner of the vineyard do? This would have likely had the crowd grumbling and grousing for retribution of some shape or form. Likely they would have cited Old Testament law. Because it would be capital punishment. Because in Genesis 9:6 says that if you take a life, your life is forfeit. Every individual that fell underneath that would face execution. So this enraged the crowd. We get to see how the crowd is enraged in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 41. They said in the hymn, the crowd actually responds to Jesus and says, He's going to put an end to those wretches, to a miserable death. And not only that, but He's going to lend out the vineyard to other tenants who will give Him the fruits in their due season. That answer came from the crowd, says Matthew. Jesus is prepared to deal and reveal the truth. Not only that, but if you look at Luke's account in chapter 20, verse 16, the crowd finds this scenario so repugnant, they say, surely not, that's going to happen, meaning that the people, the tenants would fail to give the prophets as they were to come in. Surely not. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Jesus has set them up. Did the crowd understand the implications of the parable? Likely, because if you look on down into Mark 12:12, it says, for they perceived that He had told the parable against them. You see, they would have been drawn in to such an extent that they were sympathetic to the owner. And what they don't understand is, here's the thing, they agreed with the owner, God. So let's look at the significance. We know God's the owner and the religious leaders are the lessees. They're the contract laborers, if you will. The contract is the law of God. And the law of God is to be shared with all. The leaders were responsible for setting the tone when it came to sharing God's truth. Not keeping it, not bastardizing it, making it into something that it that it was not. In a sense, they were to make disciples. So the harvest time is a period of when God comes back and He what? He expects fruit. The investment of the Old Testament law, if you think about it, is to make disciples, to make followers, worshipers of God. But clearly God's expectations are unmet. You see, the entire Old Testament reveals and it records their wanton adultery. They didn't merely just teach the law incorrectly. The disciples that they made were more wicked than they were. Matter of fact, you get to see that in Matthew chapter 23. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," on into 24. Woe, woe. He says, "You compass the world about to make one proselyte, and you make him twice the fold the child of the devil." You see, they thought they were good folk. The servants we see, the people that God had sent in, some of them were prophets, the others were people like the judges. The prophets were called to demonstrate fruit. They were to bring what? Fruits of repentance and worship. You see, the prophets did this. What did the prophets deal with? They dealt with humiliation, brutality, and ultimately their demise. There are two that I know that lived. One of them was taken up in a chariot, right? Elijah. The other one would have been Jeremiah. Perhaps some of the others were not martyred. We don't know all of the particular circumstance. So what we have, if you were to read in Hebrews chapter 11, though, we see a bunch of them that are listed. But if you listen to what Jesus says, this is how Israel responded to God's overtures. Certainly all the prophets were sent away, and they were expressed in different ways. Matter of fact, Jeremiah 7:25 gives us a clue as to their treatment. If you consider what I said about Matthew chapter 23, Jesus offers up 7 woes to them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we would have lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part in them in the shedding of blood of the prophets. You see, the prophets were holy to the people of Israel until they weren't. Jesus calls Israel a brood of vipers. He says, therefore I say unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of them you will kill and crucify, some of them you will flog in your synagogues, and you will persecute from town to town. In fact, in verse 35 he says, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. And he says, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Boy, there's good news for you, right? In this feel-good generation that we're in, having people with high self-esteem, boy, that's a good one. This generation that Jesus is dealing with is the most murderous of all. So ultimately, Jesus is sent, right? And what do? They're in the process of taking the Son of Man, and they're going to kill him. They are going to reject the heir. And once he passes away, they are going to assume control over the inheritance. They're going to have the control, the power, the prestige. Indeed, Christ is going to die on the cross. But these wicked religious people, what are they going to do? They're going to move on to the saints. They are going to harry the saints. They are going to persecute and kill them as they can. This is a wholesale rejection of the heir. So what's God going to do? Well, God's going to judge those who do not bow down and do His will. And we find out that an installment is about 37 years in the future. In 70 A.D., when Israel is completely mowed down, destroyed, there's no longer going to be records identifying the priests. The temple will be destroyed. There's really nothing left of Judaism left anymore. The chief priest will disappear. The religious system and all of its attachments are no longer in existence today. You realize that, right? There's not even a temple. The individuals that were involved face eternal punishment, eternal damnation. You see, they've failed in their stewardship of God's things. God gave them the choicest. So what has God done? He's, practically speaking, God has given the vineyard to others. These people who shall come through the church, through the saints, whom we would call the 12 apostles. You see, it starts with the apostles, but it moves on as we see throughout the New Testament. However, it's the apostles who receive the initial call to become disciples and followers of Christ. And it's they who are going to continue spreading the gospel beyond themselves to others. That's the fruit that God wants. This is just a building. It's going to burn. 1 Peter talks about it. It says that God's going to burn this universe with an unquenchable fire. You know what's going to be left? There's only going to be the saints who are in heaven and the damned who will be in hell. Everything else is going to go the wayside. You see, we are to be a light and a salt in this new era. You see, God's vineyard is in our world even today at this moment. His followers are disciples. Do you understand this, dear heart? There are no others. You're either a disciple, a follower of Christ, or you're not. To put it, as a mentor of mine said, you're either a saint or you're an ain't. You're either a saint or you're an ain't. One is a disciple or you are not. It is they who take the gospel to the world. We're responsible for unleashing the gospel in this world, for storming the gates of hell that will not prevail against us. Our mission is to spread the mission of the gospel, not our opinions. We're to make disciples and present them to Christ as fruit. These are the results of our stewardship as Christians. Sitting in the pew, that ain't going to make any difference whatsoever. He's going to ask you, how many grapes, how many people have you brought to me? Now, remember, this is a labor. So before we go, oh man, I haven't shared Christ in the last month or year or even 5 years. Before you get down on yourself too far, I would throw you this bright ray of sun. It's a collective labor effort. Jesus talks about that, where we get to enter into the labor of others who have worked before. How many people have I shared the gospel with that I've not gotten to pick that fruit? But you know who else has? Somebody in the kingdom got to pick it. And you know what? One day, we're going to know that. We're going to know who we've influenced for Christ. God's going to make that readily apparent. Right now, it's a bit frustrating, isn't it? Because we're like, man, I've shared the gospel 40 times in the last week or whatever else. And we kind of go around and we're like Eeyore. And we don't see the fruit of our labor. Well, can I tell you this? When I was younger, we've got family and they're farmers. And when you start planting seeds, it doesn't come up right away. Matter of fact, nobody is putting seed in the ground right now. March. Beginning of March, end of February. Nobody's planting right now physical crops. Oh, they may be doing it elsewhere, but they're not doing it here. Those seeds will go into the ground somewhere April. Just depends on how dry you can get the tractor out there into the fields. It takes a long time. You don't see it, and then you just see what? This little sprig. But then what happens by July? That corn's way up here. And then what do you see? Fruit. It takes a while to see the fruit. You see, we make disciples. We. That's what he says. That's the Great Commission. He says, you make disciples. And we do that as a collective. The question that confronts you, that confronts me today is this. What fruit do we have for the landowner? Understand this. To have fruit requires positive effort. It requires positive effort. Just standing on the sidelines garners no fruit. We have to intentionally plant it, cultivate it, and harvest it. It has to be intentional. That's it. That's what Jesus is speaking about them. And you know what he's said about Israel? Every last one of you are either a bunch of lying, lazy, no accounts. I'm finding somebody else to give my garden to. That's going to be the church. Now, just to right-size this, don't think for a minute that he won't remove you. If he removed Israel, his hand-picked people, if he wiped their city out, don't think that God won't do it again. Our time of invitation is as we come here. I don't know how God has spoken to you. The altar's open. Maybe you need to come and you need to be born again. Maybe you don't know what it's like to be born again. Maybe you need that explained to you so that you can become a follower of Christ. Maybe you need to come and you need to repent because you have not been laboring in His kingdom. Altar's open.